Hi, family. Can you see me? Still working out this camera and this software, but this is Arthur. I am doing a screencast with this program that I just got. I'm trying to learn, and the purpose is for me to practice the presentation that I'll be giving at a conference later this week, and the study that I'll be presenting is my dissertation. So this is what I've been doing for about a year and 3 months or so. That was a year and 3 months ago is when I started designing this study. It was based on some, or maybe it was an outgrowth of studies that I'd been doing in the past. But so this is kind of a long line of research that I've been doing since I was getting my master's degree. Basically, how do Americans respond to terrorism, terrorist propaganda, and in this particular study, how Americans react to ISIS propaganda videos. And in this case, it was CNN broadcasts of ISIS propaganda. So the title is a little jargony. I'm going to try to avoid using a lot of jargon that's really psychological, because the conference that I'll be presenting this at and my dissertation defense, there'll be people there that are interested in the subject and knowledgeable in other ways, but not knowledgeable in psychological jargon. So anyone who wants to actually watch this video, if I could just get some feedback on maybe my language or whether or not something doesn't make a lot of sense or isn't clear, feel free to send it to me, and I will take that all to heart and try to make this the best presentation I can. So my initial question back in 2015 was, how do Americans respond to ISIS propaganda? So the studies that I've been doing previous to that were similar, but it had more to do with whether or not Americans respond in a certain way to the war on terror. And it was around the time of the Boston Marathon bombing, which happened right in the middle of my data collection, so I was able to compare before and after. But right around 2015, when I started thinking about my dissertation, ISIS was putting out a lot of propaganda videos. So I don't know if you can see this mouse here. ISIS was putting out these gruesome videos of beheadings, killings, destruction, filmed by ISIS, really high production value. And they were disseminated through official and unofficial social media. So ISIS and a bunch of ISIS affiliates had Twitter accounts and other social media accounts, and they were disseminating these awful videos. And it seems that the videos were more of a recruiting tool. So if they could be high production and show that ISIS, triumphs over these victims, it was a way of showing the strength of ISIS and hopefully to recruit people from the West or from throughout the Middle East to come join the cause of ISIS. But that doesn't mean that the ISIS videos didn't have other secondary effects. Specifically, I was curious about whether or not the existence of these videos, and their being broadcasted on CNN and other news outlets, was changing Americans' opinions, not just about ISIS, but about Muslims in general. So my question was, how do Americans respond to ISIS propaganda? Does it change their mood to see a video or a CNN broadcast about ISIS propaganda? Does it change their support for anti-Muslim security policies? So in my case, I was very interested in stop and frisk type policies where law enforcement was able to just stop people randomly and search them or search their things. And more negative feelings toward Muslims. So does it just change how people feel about Muslims in general? Americans, how Americans feel about Muslims. And then the second question was, are there any personality traits or demographic traits, psychological variables that influence how people react to the video? So not everyone's going to react in the same way. What determines why this particular person seems to respond in one way and why this person responds in a different way? So there was some research that was done on similar things in the past. For instance, about the news and well-being. So traumatic events that occur in the news, do they have an influence on people's mental health? There were a couple things. One, I found a study about the Oklahoma City bombing. So, in the wake of the Oklahoma City bombing, they did some surveys with some middle school students and found that post-traumatic stress actually occurred in these students in Oklahoma City and the surrounding areas as a function of news exposure, meaning the more these kids were watching news about this bombing, the more they were getting these stress type symptoms, post-traumatic stress symptoms. That doesn't mean necessarily they're getting PTSD or the full disorder, but they're getting more symptoms. Same pattern in adolescents after the 2013 Boston Marathon bombings, another study that showed a similar thing. A really interesting study I found conducted in Israel after a certain military operation called Operation Protective Edge that was launched against Gaza in 2014. So they actually surveyed a bunch of Israelis about news consumption. The interesting thing they found was that 70% reported the news about the war was stressful, but they still felt compelled to watch. So specifically, the majority of people called them burdensome to watch, but also addictive. Basically, this is awful and it's harming me in some way, but I can't stop watching the news because they're afraid they might miss some important information that might, make them safer or help them avoid a place that might be that they don't want to go. So addictive but burdensome. Some other symptoms that were reported after watching the videos: physiological hyperstimulation, uncontrolled fear or anxiety, sleeping difficulties, fearful thoughts occurred all in different proportions of those who had watched them. They wanted to compare people who had watched these newscasts to people who weren't watching the newscasts. And the interesting thing was they couldn't even find enough people who weren't watching the news to do a study. So the country of Israel was just completely inundated with this. So what influences reactions to distressing and violent news? Well, some potential traits that have been identified in the literature: anxiety sensitivity, meaning how fearful are you of being anxious. In my previous study that I actually published it in 2016 this year, is perceived closeness. So basically, in a previous study, we were able to see that if we framed the war on terror as something that was happening in a person's community, how can we fight the war on terror in our community? People were more willing to support prejudicial policies against Muslims than when they were considering the war on terror being waged kind of in the on the federal level. And that effect strengthened after the Boston Marathon bombing. So the Boston Marathon bombing brought terrorism to the United States. And then when we were asking people about fighting terrorism in their community, suddenly they were more willing to accept these prejudicial policies than they were before. The third thing I thought of was psychological inflexibility, which hadn't been studied before. So what is psychological inflexibility? Well, it's a type of reactivity to distressing internal and external events. It was derived from acceptance and commitment therapy and relational frame theory. So to put this in very plain and simple terms, psychological inflexibility is the tendency to pull away from valued life directions in order to avoid or escape distress. So what is motivating your behavior? Are you being motivated to do a certain thing just to make a bad feeling go away? Or are you motivated to engage in a certain behavior because it gets you closer to your values, the things that are important to you in your life? So maybe a simple way to think about this is if you have an itch, what is that compulsion to scratch? Take yourself away from whatever you're doing and scratch this itch to make that bad feeling go away. So this trait, psychological inflexibility, is tied to depression, anxiety, stress, and somatic symptoms, which was its original intention. The idea being like, okay, say a person is depressed. Well, if I wake up in the morning and I just feel awful because I have depression, I might say to myself, you know what? It's just not worth it to go into work today or to go to school today. It's just not worth it. It's going to make me feel worse. So instead, I'm just going to stay in bed. So you've made a decision, even though school or work might be important to you, you've made the decision to avoid that behavior just because you don't want to feel bad. And so That's a kind of a simplistic way to look at it, but I think everyone to a certain degree can relate to that. But they also find that psychological inflexibility is tied to prejudice. Okay, so think about it this way. If you're an employer and you're looking for somebody to work for you, and you get 2 resumes on your desk, social psychology research in the past has found that, a resume that is 2 resumes that are identical with just a picture of a racial minority versus a white person, there's a bias towards the person who's white when it's a white employer. So what's going on there? Well, this theory of psychological inflexibility would say, if I'm a white employer, being around a person who's different from me is just going to be slightly uncomfortable. It might even be just a slight discomfort that exists within me that I don't even really notice that much. It's just kind of there, and it might be influencing my behavior a little bit, but I might not even be fully present with that. I might not even realize it. And so that discomfort might actually push me just slightly towards the white candidate. So now think about how that might manifest itself in the real, out in the world, not just in an experiment. Is the psychological inflexibility sort of pushing you away from things that are making you uncomfortable, interacting with people who are different, interacting with people that disagree with you? So that would be psychological inflexibility and how it could be tied to prejudicial actions. So I created this model, a working model. So we have a terrorist event, and it's displayed in the news. Okay, that generates an unwanted internal experience, negative affect. Negative affect is just a psychological word for bad mood. Affect is mood, negative mood. Okay, so seeing this awful, violent video perpetrated by these terrorists causes discomfort. I don't like that. It's just awful. I don't like thinking about that. Okay, so am I high in this trait of inflexibility, or am I low in inflexibility? We'll say that I'm low. Well, if I'm low in this trait of inflexibility, that means that even though I feel bad when I watch this video, I'm just going to accept that bad feeling. I'm not going to try to change my behavior or my opinions, or my support for a certain policy just because I feel bad. I'm not trying to make that feeling go away. And so it results in no behavior change. Now imagine I'm a very, very inflexible person. Well, in this case, I see this awful terrorist event happen, and I just have to make these bad feelings go away. And so what can I do to make these things go away? Well, what will help me feel safer? What will help me feel better knowing that there's terrorism out there? Well, maybe I might be more willing to support a policy that infringes on civil rights, but gives me the feeling that I'm safer. Because even though it's a civil right, I don't want, to be a victim of some terrorist event. So the result would be change in feelings toward Muslims and behavioral attempts to reduce the negative feelings, resulting in support for prejudicial policies against Muslims. So I did one study in fall of 2015. I showed 4 CNN news videos to 69 undergraduate students. Actually, it was more students than that, so I need to change that slide. It was more students than that. I was really interested in 2 of the videos, but so one was called Flames of War. It was an ISIS propaganda video released in late 2014, showing ISIS militants executing Syrian soldiers that they had captured. There was an awful video released in Libya by an ISIS affiliate. It's not 100% clear how they're connected to ISIS in Syria, but where they had abducted 21 Egyptian Christians, Copts, and they were beheaded on a Libyan beach. And it was the video was stated that it was to the people of the cross, so it was towards Christians. The victims were Christians. There was another video that I chose that was destruction of Palmyra. So Palmyra was an ancient archaeological site that ISIS trashed. It was really dumb, and it just makes me mad just to think about it. But They they destroyed this really priceless ancient city. And then I chose a fourth video that was unrelated to ISIS, and it was about James Holmes, the shooter who shot into a movie theater and killed some people in Colorado. I took a CNN video about the testimony. It's a very sad video, but it's not about Muslims or extremists. And so I put that in there just so I could compare. I measured emotions before and after using a scale of different emotion words. Basically, I just gave people a list of words and they said, to what degree am I feeling this word? And then afterwards, I measured their support for various security policies. So random searches of Muslims, random searches of Middle Easterners, as well as other policy questions that I kind of randomly presented, so it wasn't so obvious what I was getting at. And then I measured people's feelings toward various religious groups. So basically I said, how do you feel towards the following groups? And the way that the scale works, it's kind of a social psychology trick. The scale goes from cold to warm. So it says, how do you feel? How cold or warm do you feel toward these various groups? It goes from 0 to 100. And the reason we use cold and warm is cold and warm are two emotions that are highly correlated with prejudicial feelings toward various groups. So if I say that I feel very cold towards someone, what I'm really saying is I dislike being around them. I don't like them very much. But it's a way to say that in a way where you're not actually saying that. So people feel a little bit more free about being honest in saying, oh, I feel cold towards a certain group, or I feel warm towards a certain group. If I feel warm towards someone, I like them. I want to be around them. So that's how I measured that. And 0 to 100 was nice because it gave me a good range. So these were my results at the time. So this first group graph shows you feeling toward Muslims. So I just asked people how cold or warm. Here's 50 right here. So here's the line. And here's the 4 videos that I showed. So already you can see the default of the slider is set at 50. So already you could see that in general, the slider was going to move down if I asked people how they feel toward Muslims. But when people watched the Flames of War video, it was a little higher. Here's the James Holmes, which is the Colorado shooter. And then here was the video with Egyptian Christians, and here's the destruction of Palmyra. So when people saw Christians being executed and this ancient city being destroyed, that resulted in the lowest feeling towards Muslims. And this was statistically significant, meaning it was more likely to not be the result of chance, that this was lower. I got a very interesting result when I looked at support for anti-Muslim policies. So in this case, higher scores mean higher support for anti-Muslim policies. So again, we see that Egyptian Christian video and Palmyra are higher than the other two. But in this case, it was not statistically significant. But it was in the same direction as this one. So that kind of gave me a clue. This was a pilot study. So a result of this was I chose this Egyptian Christian video to use in my next study because I knew it probably packed the most punch. It was the one that seemed to offend people the most and had the biggest effect on how people felt toward Muslims. So my main study this is my main dissertation study. So in this one, I actually paid some money. I got 465 undergraduate students, 435 online survey workers using a survey service called Amazon Mechanical Turk. It basically sends surveys out, paid surveys out to people just to take them. And in that survey, I asked them questions about some traits, and then I showed them one of 3 videos: the mass beheading video, the 21 Egyptian Christians, the James Holmes video, and then I added a video about a teacher who would won a prize for being a really good teacher. It's not sad at all. It's actually a little inspiring. So that was more of a control. And then I gave people the option. I said, this video might be graphic, so if you want, you don't have to watch it. And so I had a 4th group of people that opted out of watching the video. I measured psychological inflexibility before they watched the video, and I measured their emotions before and after. I also measured feeling toward Muslims and other religions, groups, politicians, institutions. So instead of just measuring their feelings toward Muslims and different religions, I added in a ton of stuff. Brands like McDonald's, Abercrombie and Fitch, musicians Adele, Kanye West, institutions, U.S. Congress, Barack Obama, Donald Trump, Hillary Clinton. I asked people what their feelings are with a bunch of different groups: African Americans, Mexican migrant, farm workers, Hispanic Americans, a lot of just different labels just to say, hey, how do you feel about this group? I even put illegal aliens in there, and that was for a study I did with my brother Thomas at another time. So then I measured their support for the security policies, and this time, because it was a little later, summer of 2016, I added whether they supported banning Syrian refugees from settling in their state. So I'm not going to post all the regression tables because probably you don't want a bunch of numbers. So I'm just going to answer the broad questions that I asked when I did the analysis. 1. Did the ISIS video increase negative affect? Basically, did watching the ISIS video put people into a bad mood? Answer, yes. In both the online and student samples, watching the ISIS video put people in a bad mood. So did the James Holmes video, it was a sad video. Teacher video did not. So teacher was inspiring, so that didn't increase their negative mood. Did the ISIS video increase support for prejudicial policies? No. It actually did not in either sample. So just the existence of that video did not increase support for prejudicial policies. Now remember, in this study, it kind of elevated support for prejudicial policies, but the effect wasn't statistically significant. So it was if this is a real effect, it's a very weak one. I think there might be a difference just because the videos were fresher back in 2015. By the time I did this study in 2016, a lot of people were saying that they'd already seen the videos and it didn't really have the same effect on them anymore. Did psychological inflexibility have a difference? So basically, did a person high or low on psychological inflexibility change how they responded to the video? And the answer was no. So my hypothesis was not supported in that case. But one thing I did find that was interesting was that support for prejudicial policies was highly dependent, after watching the mass beheading video, was highly dependent on the degree to which they were in a bad mood afterwards. If you could watch that video and you were not put in a bad mood, you were likely not supportive of prejudicial policies. So that was interesting to me. I'm starting to see that it wasn't inflexibility at all that seemed to be the causal mechanism or the moderating mechanism. It was just the mood. So I did another study, and this is one that I just now finished right before the election happened, the presidential election. I basically looked at the emotions that resulted in watching any of the videos. So after watching a video, what types of emotions resulted and in what ways did they cluster? And which of those emotion clusters predicted prejudice against Muslims? So what I found was that it was anxiety and fear. So there was one cluster of emotions that involved feeling jittery, anxious, fearful, those types of words. Those predicted whether or not a person was prejudiced after watching the beheading video. Not sadness, not anger or hostility, not irritability, not shame, not positive emotions. It was really just fear and anxiety that were the driving the mechanism for the prejudicial response. So what is the conclusion from the study and my follow-up study? In fall of 2015, the videos significantly caused lower feelings about Muslims, but by 2016, this effect seemed to disappear. Prejudice reactions toward to news about ISIS propaganda related to emotions. Now, one interesting question that I might have is this correlation or causation? Well, what we find is that if we show a person the beheading video, the ISIS beheading video, or a CNN a news broadcast of it, fear is tied with prejudicial actions. Which causes which? I mean, maybe a person who's prejudiced will will have more fear. I can't rule that out because it was just correlations that I found. So depending on what theory I might have later on, I might be able to, tease that out. But for right now, I can't say which is which. So that's the end of my video. That was my dissertation in a nutshell. If you have any questions or comments, just let me know. Thank you for watching.